I love this conference. This is probably my favorite conference. And I was a little worried how we were going to follow up that, the previous panel. That was so much fun and interesting. And also my favorite topic, Du Bois double consciousness. I mean, after that, that's just going to be hard to beat that. So what we have here is a discussion about big data and theorizing big data and thinking of its political, cultural, and social impacts. And we have this amazing lineup of Zeynep Vertesi, who does work on space exploration and NASA and virtual and real teams and how they work together. And she's also, I'm going to not tell you, you will see. She has a surprise and a reveal for the world of the internet. And then we have Winter Mason, who is a data science team in the data science team on Facebook, and he's going to be exploring how it looks from the inside, and we can direct your questions to him. And we have Kate, and everybody here, it's like people don't need introducing, Kate Crawford, who's at Microsoft Research, and she's been just at the forefront of asking the big questions, asking the tough questions that we do need to ask for big data, and bringing all the great insight into it. And again, I'm a Theorizing the Web groupie, so that's my introduction. So we'll start with Janet.
Great. Thanks. Can I get the slides, please? Awesome. Thanks. And so thanks so much for having me here. It's really a pleasure to speak to you today. In my brief remarks, I'm going to try to do three things. I'm going to describe what I see as a gaping hole in our critical discourse about the internet and about social media more generally. Secondly, I'm going to tell you how buying a stroller can make you look like a criminal. And thirdly, I'm going to argue that in moments of protest, that sometimes shutting down social media is the best thing the state can do for the protesters. And I'm going to do this through a story of infrastructural inversion. I'm going to tell you the story of the last 9 months of my life, of trying not to let the internet know that I'm pregnant. This is difficult to do. So I say it's an infrastructural inversion because it's based on the principles that Bowker and Starr established in the 1990s about how to make those invisible sunken layers of infrastructure that surround us and that influence our behavior in so many ways, how to make those visible and accountable, how to look at the kinds of categories that they inscribe and the kinds of assumptions they make about our behavior to better understand their role in our lives. And in my case, the infrastructure I was particularly interested in subverting or bringing to the fore was this relatively new sunken layer of the internet, right? This layer of bots and beacons, trackers, and cookies that are feeding data-driven marketing databases for the purposes of targeted advertising. So my story is one about big data, but from the bottom up, from a very personal perspective of what it takes to avoid being collected, being tracked, and being placed into databases. Now this became especially important in my life about 9 months ago because pregnant women, as you may know, are incredibly valuable to data-driven marketing databases. For most people, their data goes for about 10 cents a person. For pregnant women, it's about $1.50 each. And this is because we're making decisions for the first time about particular kinds of consumption patterns that are going to dictate our lives for the next 8 years, right? If I decide Pampers or Huggies, that's a big cash-in for whichever one I decide, right? And many of you have probably heard the story by now, which has become emblematic of this kind of activity of the teenager, obviously, in the Midwest, whose local Target store knew that she was pregnant before her father did. But what's perhaps new here is that it's not just happening offline through database collections, happening through consumption patterns, but also online as well, and increasingly in conjunction between the two. So I'll tell you a little bit about what I did for the last 9 months to try to avoid being detected as pregnant by the internet and by these data sniffers. So the first thing, obviously, is not to say anything on social media. Now, I didn't want to, recuse myself from social media entirely, but obviously this is one of the biggest ways of collecting marketing-oriented information about personal consumers, right? So I had to be very careful about what I said. But of course, social media is not just about what you say, it's about what other people say about you too. And this became very clear when another friend of mine was tagged in a photo, and it was very clear she had a baby bump. And all the congratulations started pouring in. And at that point, she was basically outed to Facebook that she was pregnant. So when I called my family and friends, I did the very old-fashioned thing of phoning my family and friends and emailing them and saying, hey, we got great news. Please don't put it on Facebook. So I mentioned this isn't just a question of being tracked online, but offline as well, and increasingly the use of things like store loyalty cards and through credit cards and through associating unique identifiers like birth dates, locations, and names. Companies are trying to bridge the digital and the analog in building these more robust databases. So the way that we tried to enforce a digital divide in our lives was to do everything with cash. So this meant all the prenatal vitamins, all the pregnancy tests, even maternity wear, everything we bought offline, we bought in cash, in person. Of course, there's some things we did want to get online, and for that purpose we set up an Amazon account that was linked to an email address that we hosted on a personal server that we delivered to a local locker in New York, and that we managed to stack up by buying Amazon gift cards using cash. So in this way, trying to avoid or create what's now become an almost artificial divide, right, between what's happening online and offline. And finally, I'm actually here today to win the most creative use of Tor award. Thank you very much. Couldn't have done it without Tor. Actually, really couldn't have done it without Tor because it was really the only way to manage totally untraceable browsing. And I know it's gotten a bad reputation for Bitcoin trading and buying drugs online, but I used it for babycenter.com. So there's been a couple of things I've learned through this infrastructural inversion that I want to propose as challenges for our community, the things that I think we really need to address. And the first is to start taking more seriously the role of the server in our online interactions, and particularly the economic incentives that underlie the server activities that are now part and parcel of our social media interactions. Now I say this because this was really hit home for me when I had an uncle in Australia about 7 months in. And he wrote me this really lovely Facebook message. And it was like, you know, Janet, we're really excited about the pregnancy. We can't wait to meet the new member of the family. It's really great. We love you. And I responded as any rational human being would do, which is I deleted the thread of all of our conversations and I unfriended him.
It's always Australian.
Sorry. So I wrote him an email because I felt terrible. He's actually one of my favorite people. And I wrote him, I was like, I'm so sorry. I felt like I had to do this, but like, why did you do this on Facebook? And I said no. And he said, well, I didn't put it on your wall. And then a couple of weeks later, an aunt of mine in Toronto on the other side of the family also sent me a private message to chat on Facebook. Like, hey, how's the bump? And I'm like, hold on a minute, right? What's going on? Like, don't you understand that Facebook is also reading your chats and the messages? Like, when I said Facebook, I meant the entire platform. She was like, I didn't realize that a private message wasn't private. Now, I would argue on the one hand that for the people that we study that use these large kinds of social media and social data collection platforms, that the server has now become somewhat invisible, and the platform has receded into the background, in particular the economic incentives that underlie the way that server works, which is to aim for trackability, traceability, and not forgetting and remembering your data, right? This is no longer those early days of the internet when I used to run a BBS and we talked about like how data was really ephemeral. Now we're talking about how we can continue to create data that is aggregatable, that is large, and that sustains over time. And I would argue that our community, too, I think, has fallen into the same trap. We have hundreds of studies now of how people interact on Facebook or how they use Twitter to communicate face-to-face or to communicate person-to-person, but not actually taking into account the underlying server architecture and the economics that are driving those interactions. And I think this becomes not taking that into account in a way that I think is really important. And I think that becomes a problem for us in terms of, we've now started to do things like surface infrastructures like bots or in Wikipedia, or the particular affordances of Facebook's reciprocal friendship architecture versus retweeting. But we haven't really addressed seriously what it means for users as they now start to consider the long-term implications of how and when they're going to be held accountable for what they've said online and where. Now, secondly, I can tell you about when we bought a stroller. Now, we did a lot of research online on Tor, looking at a stroller, and strollers are a big-ticket purchase, so you want to make sure you get the one that you want. It's also New York, so everyone's always checking out your stroller on the street to see like who you are and like what class you're in, and like, oh, you got that one, did you? So we decided there was a great one. It was on sale on Amazon. So my husband trotted off to the corner store, and he withdrew $500 in cash, and he went up to the counter to get the gift cards, and this is what he saw. So Okay, so we've got, copious uses of Tor, copious cash withdrawals at random ATMs all over the city, and now this notion of like, hey, did you know if you take out too much money and put it on a gift card, we're going to notify the authorities. So I think there's something important here because those kinds of activities, when taken in the aggregate, particularly when you're considering across a kind of big data landscape, are exactly the kind of things that would tag you as likely engaging in criminal activity as opposed to just having a baby. But I'm also really inspired here in the way that Tarleton Gillespie talks about how the iPod makes us moral. He talks about how what was amazing about the iPod was that it inscribed its users into a particular system where not only the physical iPod itself, but also things like iTunes and the Recording Industry of America and a variety of other actors conspired to mean that every time you purchased a song or every time you played something on your iPod, you were doing so in a moral way, in a way that had been considered to be moral by the people that set up the technology. And of course, this draws on Bruno Latour's notion of how technologies like the speed bump or the safety belt make us moral as well. So here it is a moment where I'm inscribing a network of consumption, of technologically underlaid consumption, right, in which the assumption is one of tracking and one of traceability and a data collection regime in which to be moral is to participate in that regime. And what that means is that there's some profound implications for how we talk about things like resistance and choice. And the first is the notion that resisting that, to descript the network, to try to step outside of that, is to appear to be immoral, in some cases to appear to be even criminal, but certainly to look like not a good citizen. And this is somewhat outrageous given this was not the case maybe 3 or 5 years ago, but I think it's really important to understand how these not just consumption outlets, but also the kinds of technologies that underlie them are making us produce data in a particular kind of way, and to opt out is not really an option. Now, the other side of this is that there are certain cases where I think it's actually very, very important and critical to be able to opt out, and critical to be able to remain invisible. And of course, there's a lot of discussion about the use of social media in the context of protest, where I can't imagine a worse technology to use than something like Twitter or Facebook to try to organize a protest, when really what it is a digital beacon being like, here I am, right? As we've noticed with things like Occupy or with things like the text messages sent to Maidan Square, that the use of a technology and the circumscribed and moral way of using it becomes an opportunity to be traced, to be tracked, and to be identified as possibly engaging in anti-citizenship kind of behaviors. And so I think, in fact, even though it was born of tremendous ignorance, I think Erdogan's shutting down of Twitter during the recent election was possibly one of the greatest things he could have done for the protesters, because 1 million people downloaded Tor, right? And started turning to other kinds of ways of descripting the network to try to communicate and try to interact with each other. And I think that's an important thing to keep in mind, is that we're not talking about social technologies anymore, we're talking about surveillance technologies. And to that end, I think there's an opportunity for this community more generally to intervene. And because I think at this point we produce very few reasonable options for choice. On the one hand, there's clearly some civil liberty issues here that really need to be addressed. But on the other hand, if you follow on with Silicon Valley and the notion that, like, well, the market will just correct for this. Like, if people just don't like these technologies, then they'll stop using them and they'll vote with their feet. But if opting out makes you look like you're a criminal, or if opting out makes you antisocial, or if opting out makes you immoral, or if it's almost impossible to do, then we're no longer talking about a free market. We're talking about coercion, right? And at that point, I think it's really important to produce new policies and new kinds of technologies that respect the right for a transaction to be just a transaction. So, thanks.
Amazing. We're now going to just switch to dongle, and I want to tell you how that works the other way. My sister-in-law, who's amazing, and we're on friendly terms. So the thing is, her parents had been bugging her to have a baby, like they had been doing the full grandparent, we want to be grandparents, like every conversation was about that. It was getting really difficult for her to even talk to her mom, so she was complaining to me about that. I said, that is very annoying, I am sure. And next time I went to buy vitamins, and I have low iron, so I always buy the prenatals. I punched in her phone number instead of mine. And I thought, you thought your mom was bad. Wait till you start getting all the paper ads. So terrible. That is very months pregnant, all the enticement must have worked because she got the coupons and everything.
I love that.
Well,
and thank you, Anna. That was a fantastic
amazing.
start. And I love the idea of self-experimentation in big data. I think this is really more and more of it.
Tour for strollers.
I also want to start with a huge thank you to Nathan and to PJ for making this the fantastic conference that it is. Big round of applause. Whose work inspires me and makes me a better scholar. So thank you very much for being part of this conference. It's just so great to be here. So as some of you know, I've been writing for the last few years about the epistemology and the ethics of big data. But I actually want to do something a bit different tonight. I want to talk about the affects of big data in order to try and answer this question. What will the lived reality of big data feel like? So to try and answer this, and I think it sort of flows on nicely from Janet's talk, she's tried a very personal way of doing it. I'm going to try this weird document mashup. I'm going to take two very large documents that got released just this year, and they each had very large cultural impacts, but for very different reasons. One is from GCHQ, the British Intelligence Agency, which was part of the Snowden trove of documents, and the other is from the Trend Forecasters K-hole. And is anyone here familiar with the game PowerPoint Karaoke? Yes. So those of you in the room who know how it works is that you have a set of slides that has nothing to do with what you're talking about, and then you just try to roll with them. This is going to be a slight adaptation of PowerPoint Karaoke, because what I'm going to do is show you slides that other people have made that I think will actually bring us some really interesting insights into the lived reality of how big data makes us feel. So back in January, we first learned about Squeaky Dolphin. So I think this is one of my favorite of the many program names because it's such a deeply Pynchon-esque kind of term. But what's interesting about Squeaky Dolphin is that it's of course the program that was designed by GCHQ but is also deployed by the NSA to monitor millions of YouTube and Facebook likes in real time, including people's usernames. And of course, this is just one of the many en masse data collection programs that we've just found out about in the last 8 months. But I'd like to argue that Squeaky Dolphin actually tells us something very different. In this document, this very long PowerPoint, it actually outlines an expansionist program to bring big data together with the more traditional approaches of the social and humanistic sciences. GCHQ has a lovely term for it. They call it the Human Science Operations Cell. And it is all about supplementing big data analysis with broader sociocultural tools that come from anthropology, sociology, political science, biology, history, psychology, and economics. And you can see how the various fields begin to proliferate and swarm as you roll through the PowerPoint till we get up to from 7 to 22 fields, depending on whether or not you count that ethnography appears twice in the top left. I'm just going to call that 22 and we'll just call it that. All right. But what I actually want to suggest about this document is that it's actually an extraordinary tale of anxiety. And it's a tale of anxiety that's being told, of course, by lolcats. Thank you, GCHQ. But also by network diagrams and social graphs and stories about psychology. And of course, GCHQ and the NSA, as we know, are the old guards of big data. And even despite their enormous budgets, their huge technical infrastructures, their arrays of highly qualified analysts, and their considerable, some would say, extra-legal powers, what we learn from this document is that the data itself is not enough. That they're actually reaching for a whole range of other epistemologies and other academic disciplines to try and make sense of the ocean of data that they have. So some people have referred to big data as representing the end of theory, but I think what these slides are actually showing us are the ways in which big data is itself a theory. It's an emerging Weltanschauung that is grounded across multiple domains in both the state and the market. And critically, big data, while it feels concretized and industrialized to us, is still in its infancy. And we can see that even for the NSA and GCHQ, these techniques are still experimental. They're porous and they're partial. We don't really know how they work best yet. But what is more unified when we talk about big data as a concept and the way that we inform its tools is in fact its power as a mythology. And this is something that we've seen before. As Donna Haraway wrote back in 1983, the boundary is very permeable between tool and myth, instrument and concept, historical system of social relations, and the historical anatomies of possible bodies. As we know, the female body is very often a target of particular forms of big data analysis. So indeed, myth and tool mutually constitute each other. So in this phrase, I think Haraway nails this common move of the technological sciences of translating the world into a problem of coding, where differences in the world are submitted, in her words, to an informatics of domination. But what I want to suggest today is that the lived reality of big data is suffused with a surveillance anxiety. And like a kind of fluorescent light in a dark corridor that sort of shows too much and doesn't show quite enough, this is basically what this anxiety gives us. As Sean McGann has written, the temporality of anxiety is future-oriented. She describes it as an expectation emotion. And those expectations are generally about risk and exposure and failure. So I want to consider how the surveillance anxiety is always a conjoined twin. It's the anxiety of those being surveilled together with the anxiety of the surveillance. So the anxiety of surveillance is often really hard to see. It's generally hidden in classified documents and delivered in highly coded languages in front of Senate committees, and sometimes you get a glimpse of it in slides like this, where you can see almost a classic PowerPoint slide. Really, data goes up over time. It gets really difficult. It's almost a classic. I love this one. It's one of my favorites. But this is also why it's so extraordinary that we can look at these pictures here tonight, and Snowden has actually made it possible for us to look into some of the concerns of intelligence agencies. And I want to be clear that I'm not equating the anxieties here. There's obviously a huge power asymmetry between the surveillors and the surveilled in the current environment. But neither are those with the greatest power actually free from being haunted by a very particular type of data anxiety. And it's summed up, I would like to suggest, in the central slide in the Squeaky Dolphin deck, which has an incredibly resonant question, rich with uncertainty. What can we tell? Well, what can we tell? Fittingly, half of this slide is blacked out, and I'm presuming it is for national security issues. Or maybe it was always just a black empty space. This difficult question is also reflected in the anxieties, I think, of those who are surveilled, in other words, us. So we have this question, but with a twist. What can they tell about me? And I think this is where Janet's work is really useful. And I think for me the best document that captures that consumer side of surveillance anxiety is by K-Hole. Now, K-Hole are a group of artists with backgrounds in marketing. They're based in New York City, and their work straddles the space of art and advertising and all of those lovely gray zones in between. And they produce these fabulously glossy PDFs, which are nominally produced for the public, but I think their real aim here is a form of cultural criticism. They like to undercut themselves first, though, by using the language and design of marketing PowerPoints and corporate inspiration posters as this kind of sneaky left hook of self-satire. So where GCHQ and the NSA's PowerPoints are designed with an almost charming naivete, K-Hole is all about knowingness. It's about the wink and the nudge, and it's about design as a critique and as a piss take. So I'm going to focus on their most recent report, Youth Mode, which was launched earlier this year at London's Serpentine Gallery and produced in collaboration with the Sao Paulo group Box 1824. This is now the famous document where we first heard the term normcore, and they shared it with the world. So as a term, normcore is meant to suggest the opposite of think different. They write that having mastered difference, the truly cool try to master sameness. Slipping in with the mainstream is described as the ultimate camouflage. And this is not irony. This is not about being normal with a twist. This is about seeking the freedom, and I quote, that comes from non-exclusivity, being nothing special, and realizing that adaptability leads to belonging. So terms like normcore might sound like the lexicon of dickheads, and that's a phrase from Hugh Levy. It's a fantastic phrase. But he argues, and I think he's right here, that these are carefully produced portfolios of case studies that actually build a more thoughtful model for understanding the cultural phenomena and the fluid consumer subjectivities that we're currently inhabiting. And I'd also like to argue that they capture this moment of mass surveillance meeting mass consumerism. It's this dispersed anxiety that wishes nothing more than to shed its own subjectivity. So normcore, as it was invented by Cahill, is this eerily accurate model of cultural anxiety, but normcore, as it was adopted by the fashion press, has become something else. It's become, and I quote, the look of nothing. This comes from New York Mag, which ran a very big feature about normcore, where they wrote, I could no longer tell if my fellow Soho pedestrians were art kids or middle-aged middle American tourists. So obviously, blending in gives you a certain cultural power in 2014. And fair enough, standing out might mean being on a no-fly list or being on a heat list in Chicago. But this gets even more interesting when we think about the other people in New York who have suggested dressing like a tourist. And here I'm thinking of Occupy. So Occupy, hosted workshops in New York, which they called the Civilians Workshop, where people were taught how to dress to blend and look like tourists, in a broader discussion of street tactics, which is how do we stop the police from harassing us? If we look like everybody else, they won't beat us up. It's actually a very well-known tactic. But instead of this tactical threat, normcore fashion is much more abstract and open-ended. It's about avoiding detection at all times and adopting a kind of comfortable sameness. So who gets to be normcore? Who gets to be just one abstract data point amongst millions? Or to put it the old-fashioned way, who has nothing to hide? Well, there's a rich history to answer exactly these questions, and I'm thinking of the work of people like Virginia Eubanks here, who recently asked that if you want to see the future of surveillance, look to poor communities. She's done some fantastic studies about the way in which people on welfare benefits have their purchases tracked and assessed via electronic benefits cards, and they're being exposed to much higher levels of police scrutiny and camera surveillance. So even though these tools and techniques are now being widened out to a much wider population, the greatest impact is still being felt by marginalised communities, people of colour and low-income populations. So the cultural idea of disappearing is becoming cool at the very historical moment when it's becoming impossible because of big data. And this is one example that I'm sure many of you are familiar with if you can see that one. This is actually a text message that was sent out on January 21 during a street protest in Ukraine. Ironically enough, it was a protest about laws that were going to restrict public assembly. So people were actually protesting at the same time. They all got this message, which says, and I quote, "Dear subscriber, you are registered as a participant in a mass disturbance." So this is the new realpolitik of protest under big data. And let's also be clear, it's also very cost effective. And here I'm thinking of Ashkan Soltani and Chris Sagoyan's study on how much cheaper data surveillance is compared to agents actually having to follow people. That means there's this powerful current of economic efficiency underlying big data's desire to model the social world, both for state and corporate sectors. So the neo-positivist claim that big data speaks for itself also promises particular kinds of cost savings with human labour, while simultaneously disguising the labour that was required to gather, clean, and interpret that data. So if we take these twinned anxieties, the surveillors and the surveilled, and we push them to their natural extension, what we reach is a kind of epistemological limit. On one hand, the fear that there can never be enough data, and on the other, the fear that one is standing out in the data. And these two reinforce each other in a kind of feedback loop, becoming stronger with every turn of the ratchet. As people seek more ways to blend in, be it normcore dressing or hardcore encryption, more intrusive data collection techniques are being developed. This, in Eve Sedgwick's words, creates an overarching paranoia that grows like a crystal in a hypersaturated solution, blotting out any sense of the possibility of alternative ways of understanding or things to understand. So this is, in many ways, what we might have expected. As Lorraine Daston once wrote, all epistemology begins in fear. Fear that the world is too labyrinthine to be threaded by reason, fear that authority will not be enough.
So the neo-positivist epistem is that more data is necessarily better. Therefore, there's no point where enough is enough. This is, in fact, the radical project of big data, and as such, it's a kind of epistemological limit case. So, to finish, the affective residue, or remainder of this experiment, is these free-floating anxieties, I would suggest. So along with K-hole, we can call up our norm-core emoticons, this sort of open-ended taxonomy of smartphone emotion, and look for the anxious space, which leaves us with an open question. Will there be a radical potential in the surveillance anxieties of the big data era? Thanks.
That was great too, and I'm just going to wait for mine. So this is great, and I'm now wishing I could change all my slides and address everything everybody said, because this is just wonderful conversations here. I'll try to add in a little bit, but not much. What I wanted to do was talk about from big data to ground data, and talk about my research, which really focuses on trying to be multi-method from many views. And what that gave me, oh geez, thank you. See, I'm looking at the wrong screen. What that gave me an advantage was I ended up doing research on a protest, Gezi protest in Turkey, and also looking at its big data, and also looking at its news coverage, and also going there and being there on the ground. So I got to see how it looks from multiple points of view, and I wanted to compare and contrast a little bit of that to see what do we get, what do we miss. And to start with, it's never virtual. I mean, it's online, offline, we always talk about it. It's over, there's no online, offline. It's this big, complex, augmented reality, if you will. I mean, the digital dualism, which is Nathan's coining of the term, it's dead, 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 kill it. So, click, right, so thank you. All right, there we go. So this is the Gezi protest. This is just an amazing protest. This was the protest broke out in Istanbul, which is actually my hometown, a couple blocks from where I was born. So I had to go and do the research. It was like it had my name on it as a social movement and social media scholar. And this is kind of what the square looked like: anonymous masks sold by the Roma street peddlers, who have the world's best just-in-time stock management system I have ever seen, because they had the anonymous masks and the graffiti spray paint and, you know, goggles for the tear gas, like within the day of the protest. The previous day they would have been selling flowers to the tourists. Nothing like that. So, click. Yeah, here, I'll just do this so that I won't get confused. So I want to talk about something I've written actually. Is the internet good or bad? Yes, that was my argument. And I want to talk about that because as much as the surveillance technology threatens protest, the connectivity technology also enables the same protests. And Gezi was a really good example of how both of these things are working at the same time. And in the Ukraine protest, the text messages, they didn't deter people from going. They just reminded people to turn off their phones at the protest, which was interesting. And in the Turkish case, my phone, which I do take to the Turkey, and when I want to switch to a Turkish SIM card, I have to give my citizen ID to get a Turkish SIM card. And if I want to just like not let them have my citizen ID as a Turkish citizen, the phone stops working in the Turkish 3G space after a week. So they'll let tourists get away with it, but if you're there for the 8th day, I talked with the engineers, there's no way your phone is going to work unless you go register the phone directly. So the surveillance is just very thick there, but it wasn't a deterrent. In fact, it was an empowering thing at the same time as the surveillance was there, partly because of the Penguin Media problem. So what happened was the whole, the Turkish media is heavily censored, long story. It's kind of like Russia, where there are business tycoons who own corporate media who just want to suck up to the government to get contracts. kind of sound familiar. So what they were doing was at the height of the protests in Istanbul, where the biggest square in the country with like historic importance, 48 hours of non-stop clashes. And what's on television? A documentary about penguins, of course. What else, right? I mean, if you're kind of the biggest city in the country is burning up with protests, what do you show? Penguin documentary. At the same time, CNN International was broadcasting live from Istanbul. So CNN Turkey on your left, Penguin, CNN International on your right, live from Istanbul. Somebody put these sort of by each other and took a picture, and this just became like the symbol of the protests. And non-Penguin media was obviously Occupy Gezi, Twitter, and Facebook to a degree, and WhatsApp to a large degree, and Viper, and everything you can think of was very heavily used. The censorship was completely busted. The whole movement was, the capillary of the movement was social media. There's no two ways about it. It wouldn't have come together and broken that censorship, which is why it's so important to think about it. Because even if you could opt out, what you're opting out is opting into a censored media system. You're not opting out into some, free utopia. So people had a lot of fun. This is in front of they brought penguins. They, tried to talk about it. And this was a graffiti, revolution will not be televised, it will be tweeted. It was completely non-ironic. I mean, sometimes we joke about Twitter and social media and roll our eyes. This was absolutely a lifeblood. I had people look me in the eye and said, the internet will save us. Parents were begging their children to teach them how to tweet. It was just the kind of sometimes, we talk about the hype of looking at sort of protests through sort of this Western navel-gazing of Silicon Valley thing, but then you go there and you go on the ground and you're like, wait, this isn't all hype. There is something really real about the connectivity and the empowerment that comes from the connectivity. So I went there. This is me in the middle of the protest, and this is my gear. Now, as you can see, there's no big data, anything there, but there's a tear gas mask because it's the protest. And there's a helmet, a bike helmet, because it has to, if the tear gas, the canister hits you, that's a big problem. But here's the actual thing that was really the thing that was most important for my safety is the sunblock. It's June in Turkey, it was beautiful weather, and it wasn't, the sunblock was the most important thing. So I went and got this ground up data, and I want to look at it from sort of the street level and what it was. So before I show you a little bit of what it was, I want to show you guys the hashtag. This is just the simplest chart. This is about 20 of the top hashtags that were associated with the protest. Occupy Gezi, Diren Gezi, there's 20 others, doesn't really matter what they are. Just trust me, they're the top hashtags. And it looks like there's a huge peak on May 31st, June 1st, and then June 2nd, and it then goes down. Now, there are many studies that do just this. They look at the hashtags and they will tell you what happened and when. So here, let me tell you what actually happened. What happened was the topic became so dominant, the users dropped the hashtag because there was nothing but Gezi being talked about on social media. It was just, the hashtag was dropped by the users because it was irrelevant and everybody knew what you were talking about. And if you were looking at any of this through a big data lens, because the common referent was so clearly nothing but the protest, even comments about the weather were tying to protests in some way. I mean, there's all these subtle ways in which you just couldn't see. So what looks like a drop in protest actually coincides to such a huge peak that it's dropped from the big data view. And I want to show this. I mean, these are pictures I took like when the big data is telling you the protests are dying down. They're not. They're there. They're very big and popular. And these are just sort of ground. There's tens of thousands of people camped for weeks till the expulsion came. And I looked at this through, the Twitter fire hose. I looked at it through other things. It really, unless you start reading the tweets, unless you start reading the Facebook posts, it's kind of hard to tell what they're talking about, because once again, there's this common reference to the area. Yeah, there's a context that everybody has. So this is my tear gas selfie. It's like, of course, this is this is as good as the picture could come, because it's a messy thing. Sometimes I think like we see big data can be very powerful in some ways, but sometimes I think it's just as sharp a picture as this one, in that you're really not seeing every level of the data. And here's another thing I want to complicate on how things sometimes look. This is a very common practice in Turkish Twitter use, is to take screen captures of tweets and put them like that. And this is not an exceptional tweet I pulled. This is a very common way people do it. And what she's doing is she's a government supporter, and she's criticizing 3 high-level government opponents. Well, this is going to look like a polarized data set if you do your data analysis based on mentions and links. But if you actually read the stuff, it is not a polarized data set, in the sense that people are very heavily engaging each other, and they're using tactics like not mentioning each other, taking screenshots, at worst hate linking, but not even that. I mean, I'm just thinking, well, how do you big data this? You don't. You miss this. So this anxiety you talk about, you need, if you have 1 billion tweets, you need 500,000 people to also read them if you're really going to get what's going on. And I wanted to show you guys an example of a subtweet in English. I have lots of examples in Turkish, but this one's kind of easier to understand. So this is Blake Hounshell, who is, I think now he's at Politico. He was at Foreign Policy. And he's just saying, getting crowded under that bus. And he has 64 retweets. You're like, what the heck is this? Because everybody knows what's going on. Why are they retweeting? Well, he's tweeting this during the live conference of the press conference of New Jersey Governor Chris Christie, where he blamed everybody but maybe the tooth fairy also for the bridge closures, but not him, right? So he just says getting crowded under the bus. And then everybody knows what he's talking about. In the Turkish political Twitter sphere, this is so common in the sense that people will talk at each other. It's kind of like talking behind people's back. It's just, we put people in, the culture comes in, right? You can put all the data and fields and everything. You put humans into the picture, culture comes right back in. And people will do all sorts of things that, unless you're really closely reading it, you don't see that they're talking to each other. But the subtweeting gets to the point that people will, the next day it'll be covered in the newspaper. Like somebody will subtweet someone, completely not mentioning name or anything. Somebody will subtweet an answer back, and somebody will subtweet something, and next day it'll be reported in the newspaper. It's that well understood, except it's not going to be visible to any of your scraping. So this is a poster that became really kind of like the symbolic poster of Gezi. It says, Diren means resist. It also has the connotation of occupy. It's a penguin because penguin, this is just, penguin became the Turkish protest thing. And I want to say, we really have to resist looking at one type of data. I mean, the thing is, big data is both very, very big. It's also very, very small. I mean, the point is, how many sources of big human data do we have? We have Facebook, we have Twitter, Google for search results. We actually have very few sources of human social behavior. And you might have followed the recent, brouhaha with Google flu trends, which Google searches and Google the CDC, the Center for Disease Control, actual flu numbers were tracking each other for a while. And that they diverged. Now we're lucky, we can check that with CDC so we know, when it's not working. When we're working with big data, a lot of times we're looking at just Facebook, we're looking at just Twitter, and we're looking at Google. There's a few other sources, and they're kind of very interesting. I mean, as a social scientist, they're really super interesting what you can do with it. But you have to keep in mind not to be blinded by the fact that you got 6 billion tweets. And remember, oh wait, they're all coming from Twitter. And they're all coming from a particular cultural context. I call it like the model organism problem. It's like Twitter has become our Drosophila, and I guess Facebook is maybe fish or something. It's like a little more, yeah, it's the mouse. It's a little less accessible. But we got a few model organisms, and model organism research is great for some things, but really you miss a lot of other things. So that's basically my, multiple data sources, multiple levels of view. It's just not, it's a lot more complex. And also it's a lot more interesting when you look at it that way. And with that, I will turn to,
So I didn't know that we needed slides, so I have no slides. But this gives me the chance to actually also be dynamic and respond to the things. So this is good. Yes, I'll actually just hold the mic closer to my mouth. Okay, the first thing that I want to point out is that we have yet to actually define what we're talking about, right? So what is big data? The fact of the matter is that the Large Hadron Collider collects 25 petabytes of data a year, but that's not what we're talking about, right? This is the web that we're talking about. And in fact, it's even beyond just web data, because you could actually look at just packets sent around the internet, and that's still not what we're talking about, right? What we're talking about is actually data that is collected about people, right? And that is where the crux of the matter is because suddenly, and one thing that's sort of been, I feel, also missing from this picture is the fact that the data collection is happening because people are doing things online voluntarily, right? Like it's not like, well, I mean, the NSA may be spying, may be wiretapping, probably is. However, that's not what we're talking about either, right? We're not talking about the data that the NSA collects from wiretapping. We're talking about the data that the NSA or Facebook or Twitter or whomever is sort of given through the process of people interacting online. Okay, so this is what we're talking about. And I thought that Janet raised a really good question, which is it an option to opt out, right? Is it actually possible to opt out? And I'm going to give what might be a surprising answer, being that I work at Facebook, and say, no, I don't think it is an option anymore, right? And in fact, something else that you said was, I think, very revealing about that, which is that there is it's sort of becoming a false distinction between online and offline, right? I mean, yes, obviously it's like, do you have your device? Are you actually interacting online? You can go out to the forest and take a hike, and if you don't have your electronic devices with you, nobody will know, right? You can pay in cash, and you can like do these things to get around it, sort of, right? But the fact of the matter is that, like, I mean, how many people, raise your hand if you do not own a cell phone. Yeah. Nobody raised their hand, right? The fact of the matter is that we have these devices and we're on the internet and we're using these tools because they are actually useful for us, right? What did not come up in this conversation, or at least maybe Zeynep touched on it a little bit, but the reason that this data exists is because there are benefits to it, right? And in fact, one benefit that I think might be surprising again is targeted advertising. Okay, you might say, wait, that's not a benefit, right? But I'll explain to you why it is a benefit, all right? The fact of the matter is that we, okay, how many people here have, and I'm not even going to take a show of hands, have seen those, like, lose belly fat, or, what's the home insurance? Well, then they're not doing a good job of targeting,
also self-tanning,
right? And so, yeah, self-tanning. I mean, believe me, I've gotten some terrible advertisements. I also, okay, I'm going to remind you, my name's Winter, right? I also, before I saw Game of Thrones, saw an advertisement for the t-shirt that said Winter is coming, and I was like, oh, okay, that's really targeted. But to be honest, I actually have seen an advertisement where it was like, oh, the Roots are coming to Broken Bowl. I didn't know that they were coming. It was an advertisement for them. That advertisement was there because I had liked the Roots' page. And because of that, I got to go see an awesome concert with Elvis Costello and the Roots, right? So it was like, that was a very useful thing for me. And the thing is that, like, when advertising is actually done right, it's actually useful, right? It's actually, oh, wow, that's something that I needed. That's the original point of advertising. Unfortunately, there's also the belly fat, right? Okay, and so that's sort of like our personal benefits that we get out of it. We use Facebook for a reason because it gives us like the opportunity to connect. We use Twitter for a reason because it gives us a platform to speak to people and to follow people and get really useful information from people. But there's also actually positive benefits to the actual, like from the inside, right? So this is my perspective. So for instance, Facebook did a study where they actually did a little experiment. I don't know if anybody saw this back in the presidential election. Yeah, it was I voted, right? You could click on I voted, and what they did is they actually had an experiment where for some small percentage of people, most people saw I voted, and here are like your friends and their pictures of the people that also voted, right? And then they had a holdout sample where some people did not receive that, right? Some people did not receive the faces, they just saw the I voted button, and other people received nothing at all, right? What they then did after they had done this, after the election, after they had done this, is they actually then compared the actual voting rolls with the people that were in the different treated groups, and they found that having this I voted button with the people's faces actually led to a statistically significant increase in the number of people that went out and actually voted, right? I mean, I think, you know, there's no information about how people voted, but I think that there's like, you know, an argument to say that this is actually can be used for social good, right? There's another thing that you can check out if you want. It's facebook.com/peace. Right, and this is talking about the friendships that exist between people that are from sort of in conflicting countries like Israel and Palestine, right? And just tells you about the kinds of friendships that exist between these people, right? There are benefits to be had. This is sort of the starting point. Now, as is clear, right, and as I think everybody here is aware, and part of the reason we're here is because there's also costs, right? And so starting from this premise that we want to use this stuff because it provides us benefits, right? And we basically, you know, we've gotten to the point where it's so integrated into our lives that we don't really have the option of opting out, right? What then do we do? What is the next step, right? And so then the question becomes, well, okay, who is in control of the data, right? So the government? Okay, well, let's talk about that, right? And I want to talk about this from sort of two perspectives. One is, what are the incentives of the organization or the group that holds the data, right? And what are their capabilities? What are their constraints, right? So the government, basically their incentive, and the way that the NSA is using it as evidenced by the WikiLeaks and everything, is to find threats to national security. Right? It's like trying to protect the people. I have a friend, I don't actually agree with him very strongly on this, but he's done a lot of policy work. He's actually worked closely with government and has done some work with intelligence agencies. And although he also is sensitive to privacy concerns, he's, you know, more on the side of like, look, there's actually been some cases where, you know, the information that was collected online was useful for preventing, you know, a terrorist attack or something like that. Now, there's also a lot of evidence. There's also like another study that showed that like one of the things that the like mass collection that the NSA is doing is actually not useful, right? But that's not to say that like the specific requests, like Facebook and Google and Twitter, all of them get thousands of specific requests from the U.S. government, you know, for particular information. And I think with some reasonable probability, those things are actually going to be like useful. Another example, which is sort of, you know, in this balance between security and privacy, like, you know, we, like as Facebook internally, we get lots of reports about like abuse and hate crimes and this sort of thing. This becomes a feeding mechanism. Like there, we have essentially an internal hotline where if somebody is saying that they're going to commit suicide or that there is domestic violence, where we contact the local police and send somebody out there, right? I mean, there is a balance between this, and this is what the government is like. Their incentive is safety, right? And you know, this trade-off between safety and privacy, I think, is a very important discussion, and that's part of this discussion, is like determining where is that appropriate balance between privacy and safety. Now, hypothetically, the constraints on the U.S. Government are that it's, you know, controlled by the people, right? We vote our representatives, and the representatives, you know, should represent our interests, although, you know, there was actually a very recent study, I don't know if you all saw this, that showed that the US is actually an oligarchy. So, you know, that's questionable, but I mean, this is also true when you look kind of more broadly at other countries that aren't as maybe democratic or free as the US, and then there's really no kind of contest. And I would argue that the reason why it's better to, that it's fine that like shutting down Twitter is a bad thing is because the companies are actually not held in Turkey, right? They're based in the US. Now, if the US shut down, you know, the US isn't going to shut down Twitter because they can just go to Twitter's door and knock and say, hey, give us your data, right? I mean, granted, there's warrants and that sort of thing, hopefully. Hopefully. Okay, so the government is iffy, right? Because it can, even when it's like, even though supposedly it's under our control and supposedly its only incentive is to, you know, protect us and keep us safe, there's certainly going to be lots of instances where that's just not true. Okay, so maybe it's not good if the government has access to the data, but again, in some situations that might be impossible to avoid, right? So without like shutting down the system, right? So, okay, corporations, right? What is their incentive? Their incentive is clearly profit, right? They need to make money. Yeah, that's the end. But I would argue that that's not their only incentive, because the reason why Zuckerberg started Facebook or BizStone started Twitter was not, you know, maybe money was part of the incentive, but almost surely the real motivation was that they thought that this was going to be a cool product that would help people do cool things. And it would be a lie to say that that incentive does not still exist, right? And in fact, the incentive for money making, in my opinion, and I'm sure I'll get argued on this point, but I would argue that the only reason why corporations, well, I was going to say, anyway, certainly this can change. Certainly corporations can become purely profit oriented, but I would say that to a large extent, the profits are meant to feed into the original goal of actually, you know, serving customers and providing a good product, right? I mean, yeah. Am I out of time? Okay. Okay, so I can speed up really easily, which is that, so hypothetically, corporations are dictated by people's money. You can choose not to go to Facebook, you can choose not to go to Twitter, but as Jana said, that actually makes it really hard because those are now sort of participatory parts of our culture, right? So the question is, where are these constraints? Now, it's possible that maybe the government can constrain the corporations, and the people can constrain the government. And the third party is, what if the people had the data, right? So diaspora exists. Diaspora is a social network where you control all of your data, and the only way that anybody can access it is if you give them permission, right? Feel free to download it. The fact of the matter is it hasn't taken off. Why? Well, I did a study back when I was at Yahoo where we asked people, like, do you like targeted advertising? Do you like to have your ads personalized for you? What if that data came from this site? What if it came from another site? What if it came from offline? How do you feel about this? And almost like hands down, everybody was like, no, I don't like targeted advertising. I don't want people to follow me, blah, blah, blah. And then we said, okay, how much would you pay to like continue to get your services but not have targeted advertising? And the answer was essentially $0, right? Like we said, okay, would you pay $1 a year to not have targeted advertising? And nearly everybody said, no, I'm not going to pay $1 a year to not have targeted advertising, right? So the fact of the matter is that, you know, people, although in this room, that's probably not true, right? But like at large, people are just not, it's like, yeah, when it's like brought to their attention and it's in front of their face, they're going to be concerned about it, but like, you know, how much is it worth to them? And so the question that I asked you, and what I'm going to end with is what I started with, which is just, who should control the data? We need it in order to have these wonderful services that we love. Who controls the data, and how do we make that happen? Okay. Thank you.
So thank you. Now, I'm watching the feed, and I know a lot of people who want to jump at every Facebook complaint and everything. I just want to say that Winter came all the way here not to represent everything about Silicon Valley and not to defend everything about Silicon Valley, but rather that it's important for us not to just talk to ourselves about these topics, because if we're talking to ourselves and agreeing among ourselves, that's quite nice, but I'm not sure that's furthering our understanding either. So yes, let's be challenging, but this isn't Mark Zuckerberg. So you'll see why once you check the, no, well, we'll see when you check the Twitter feed that people have a lot of Facebook questions. So let's start with questions from the audience, and let's start with, yeah.
So this microphone is for the live stream.
Yeah.
It doesn't come through these speakers. So we can all ask the question very, very loud. That's actually for the live stream.
Hi, everyone. Thank you all for your fabulous presentations.
Can you speak up a little bit
Oh, yes.
for us?
I can be really loud. I just didn't want to. Okay. I will project. So thank you all. Winter, this question is for you. And I'm really interested in how you look at advertising versus information. So you were talking about, you said something about advertising, like the point of advertising is to give people information about a product or something like that. So I'm interested because for me, advertising is something that I need to endure in order to have access to some sort of content. And I think that there's a large body of scholarship that looks at advertising in that way. So I'm interested to see how you distinguish between advertising and information that allows you to make a decision. So how do you see like the voluntary versus involuntary aspect of that? Like if you could expand upon that more, that would be really helpful.
Okay, happy to clarify. So I probably should have said that advertising in the way that it's meant to be, right? Not at all in the way that it is, right? So I think that you know, if you own a store, you own a company, you're selling products, you want to get your product out there, right? And so you do that through advertising, right? Why do you want to get your product out there? Well, you want to get your product out there because you think that, you know, if only people knew about this product, they would totally want to buy it. And so that's the informational aspect. There's another kind of advertising that is much more prevalent these days, which is purely brand advertising. And brand advertising is much less informational. It's much more about developing automatic associations in your brain between. There's this Georgie, I think, vodka ad, which I shake my head every single time I see it because it is a bottle of vodka with Georgie and a woman's butt in a bikini, and that is the whole ad, right? And so it's terrible. And the point is to build this association in your brain. And I feel like the brand advertising is the stuff that we endure, right? But because rather than the small business owner that's trying to get their product out there to provide you information about, you know, as seen on TV product that everybody should buy because I invented it type of thing, you have the brand advertising where it's Pepsi is better than Coke, Burger King is better than McDonald's or what have you. You know, I'm not a fan of that advertising either, but again, it's one of the reasons why we get a lot of the things that we like television and newspapers and social media for free. So, yeah.
Yeah, question, Jen?
Actually, I just wanted to say something to that because I'm actually the daughter of a marketing professor. And I grew up, every year there was this thing at the local theater where they played like the top 100 ads from around the world. Has anyone seen these? Does that still happen? I don't know if it still does, but it was like the highlight of our year. We used to go around Christmas, and it was so much fun because there was a lot of care and attention and thought and like playfulness in the advertising, and it was fun. And I almost worry that the sort of the targeted direction or the big data oriented, like, oh well, it's okay, we just have a database, we know exactly who to point to, is dulling some of that creativity in some way? I don't know, maybe this is just sort of an open question, but it feels like some of that, the data-driven advertising has lost that, has lost what was fun about watching ads.
Really quickly, which is, I saw a television ad when I was living in Pittsburgh that was just people standing in front of trucks saying, trucks! Right? Not a lot of care in that one. Yeah. Nothing to do with big data. But I think that they're kind of independent.
Okay. Right. So I know a lot of people have questions. I just want to ask one challenge. What if the problem is that it does get really nicely targeted? I mean, you can imagine how that might be a problem for politics. I mean, it's like when it doesn't work, it's one thing. And I'm like yeah, give me the self-tanner ads because haha, right? It's almost as if more scary for me to think that Facebook can target so well. In that study you highlighted, the PNA study, what happened was people who were nudged ever so slightly were more likely to, in the social way, were more likely to show up to vote. And this is a first past the post election country where you can, I mean, I can imagine all sorts of uses for targeted advertising that work and are scary exactly because that works. So that's something for you to wrestle with. And I'm gonna, Alice.
Hi, Alice Marwick, Fordham University. Hey, it's a great panel. Thank you guys so much for such interesting critical perspectives. So I think that one of the things that this panel has illustrated is that there's a really big gap between critical perspectives on big data and most of the mainstream discourses around big data. And I think there's two specific discourses that we should isolate. The first is about NSA surveillance and preventing terrorism, preventing crime, et cetera. And the second one is around collection of personal data and the benefit to the consumer. So as critical academics, how do you think there's a possibility for us to make an intervention into these discourses given how prevalent they are and given how they are, for the most part, the only ones that we hear in mainstream media?
Right. I mean, that's not only is that a great question, I think Janet started with one of the most important things, which is unearth this invisible thing. I mean, the first thing to do is so much of it happens sort of like the gears that you see from behind the scenes are not visible to us. So you might be telling people this is what these are your choices, but most people really aren't aware. They're not aware of EdgeRank, they're not aware of choices, they're not aware where their data goes, they are not aware what they're targeted with. Increasingly, we're seeing advertising and political advertising seep into pop culture to come back at us. So maybe as critical academics, the first thing we can do is, like, let's make this much more visible and then go from there. And I think that was Janet's first point.
Sure, I'm not sure if this is going to address your question, but one of the things I'm really a fan of is critical design and the design of new technological objects that not only surface the kinds of invisible assumptions that are present around us, but also make different options available. I'm a huge fan of options. And so I think one of the potentials here, this is a huge push, but given that so much of the current architecture of the contemporary internet, or the post sort of 2010 internet, is based on an economic model that allows for economics, basically sustenance based on personal data gathering, what can we come up with that's an alternative model? Right? What does an alternative model look like? And I'm not an economist, so I don't know. And there's certainly an advantage to the current model because it allows for more stability than what happened the first time around in the internet bubble, right? Which is where all these companies were sort of over-evaluated, and then there was like, well, there's no actual money here, and it all kind of collapsed for various reasons. And so there's a certain way in which the current just feed it personal data and it will be sustained as free services is actually pretty advantageous economically. But I think it poses so many problems and so many questions that I think it'd be valuable to have some choice. So what I would love to see is critical design interventions, and there's been some really neat things. I mean, certainly Tad Hirsch's work on different kinds of social technologies for protest, I think we need to get that stuff out there more. We need more of that, so that when the social media goes down, when the internet goes down in Egypt or in wherever or here, there are options. There are options for people to point to that allow them to not have to be accountable for those actions 5 or 10 years down the road. And I think also some of the work that's happening at NYU around obfuscation, super interesting, the building of particular kinds of technologies that will, like, for example, click on all the ads that show up so that whatever your profile tracker is gets really confused. We need more of that stuff, and we need more of that stuff that's available on a broader scale. We need more DuckDuckGos. You know, we need more of those as opportunities and options. Instead of just going, well, you know, the big 3 or the big 5 or whatever have sort of taken over this domain, there's no space for anything else. I think the option is really the big thing that we can provide.
So just a quick response, because that was such a great question from Alice. I think there's a really interesting divide in the way that we're still framing sort of the NSA and intelligence data gathering over here as being a terrorism issue, and then over here we have consumers and targeted ads, when if we've learned anything in the last 8 months, is that these two systems are intimately intertwined. And by taking them purely as systems alone, we're actually failing to see the larger emerging logic. So I think that's one of the really important things that actually happens at these kinds of events, is that we can talk about these kinds of things with people in really different industrial spaces. I also, speaking of NYU, there was a great event earlier this week where the general counsels of technology companies were talking about their engagements with the NSA and how they were actually going through this process of both, you actually referred to FISA orders earlier, Winter. FISA orders are a very, very small amount of what's happening when we see that, basically, for example, Google's servers are being tapped. We're seeing massive information gathering quite outside of what we're already aware of in terms of FISA orders. So what we're seeing is this conglomeration of agents that are operating within this system, and I think it's really useful for us to think about where the agency rests. Like, who actually has agency in this? And it's extremely difficult to make that a simple question of, it's the people against the state. That's a good start, but I actually think it's a really, really quite a complicated question. So my response to that is, it's these sorts of spaces and these kinds of debates where we can start to move the conversation onwards.
Yeah, definitely a great question. I would say that one of the things that this reminded me of, a crucial issue in this regard, is actually transparency, right? So in the question that I was asking about who controls the data, part of that, part of the way to deal with that is ensuring that, for instance, in my opinion, with the NSA, one of the biggest problems with it is that there was essentially no oversight on it. Right? So the FISA orders, there's a core, at least there's some system. I mean, it may be broken, but at least there's some system, whereas there's others where they were just collecting massive data, without any oversight whatsoever, without any transparency. I also think that there should be transparency from, the data that corporations collect, that Facebook and Twitter and they collect. There should be transparency in terms of, you should be able to go, in Europe actually, there's a law that says that the corporations are required to tell you all of the data that they have collected on you, right? And I don't think anywhere there is a law that you're required to delete it. Maybe that exists in Europe, but okay, why does that not exist here in the US, right? To me, that's the sort of mechanism that is going to sort of, bridge this gap and make both forms of data gathering kind of more highlighted in the public awareness.
One thing, and then we'll go to the audience.
Just one quick thing about the transparency issue. I actually think we're only asking transparency to do too much. I mean, this is the work of people like Helen Nissenbaum, who writes about the transparency paradox with technology, is that if you tell people, well, this is the kind of data we're collecting about you, does it actually change the way they behave? Well, we know through Facebook is that in many cases it actually doesn't. And then if you had transparency about the way that state agencies are collecting your data, what exactly are you going to do about that? So this is the myth both of transparency that also connects to the idea that we use these devices because we want to, because they're fun and because they make us happy. That's definitely part of it, but it's actually also part of our labor conditions. A lot of us actually have to use a phone to stay in touch with our employers, with our families. Facebook and Twitter have become part of actually people's jobs. So saying that they're just doing it because it's fun and it's this lovely thing, actually it's really a part of how people earn their keep now. So these questions around labor and around transparency I think are much more complex. It's not just show people how it works and they can then make their own choices. Our choices are extremely profoundly shaped by what kinds of ways we can actually make money and live in the world.
Right, let me just add that also, even if you gave everybody a choice, it's really hard for people to predict the aggregate complex what might happen as the aggregate of the individual choices. So you have, I think with online stuff, and this isn't just Facebook, this is internet everything, is that we have a tragedy of the commons in which at every single step you might actually be making a choice fully aware, let's say fully transparency and everything, and it still leads to the super surveillance environment in which the government of Turkey has the ID of every single protester in Gezi, including every single thing they did through their phones, except there was no way but to connect through our phones, right? Besides sending pigeons, that was the way to go. So transparency, yes, absolutely, let's do this. But by unearthing stuff, we should be unearthing the whole complex algorithms and the surveillance industrial complex and how it's merged with the governments, and you can really understand every single player. I mean, I even understand the NSA. They sat there on 9/11 at Fort Meade and watched and thought, we failed, we're never going to let this happen again. I mean, at a human level, I can see what's driving them, but that doesn't get us to anything further than just understanding, how a person makes a decision, how an NSA makes a decision, how Facebook makes a decision, and in the end, we're no better off in terms of, well, how do we shape our world in a more complex way than just understanding everything. So let's go to the audience. I want to give a few people in the back a chance. Do you have a...
Hi, my name is Andre Brock. I'm at the University of Michigan. I have a half-baked question/comment. So one of the things that struck me, especially with the call-outs for infrastructure, in the first two, which is I love the Valprint article, I reference it all the time. But one of the things that seems to be interesting to me, especially given your talk, Mr. Winter, is that the discussion of infrastructure seems to be limited more to the technical side, so the capabilities of the software and the servers and the hardware to collate, transfer, and store data. As opposed to ideologies of information articulation that are already pre-existing. So I tweeted earlier, a lot of these conversations about surveillance and avoiding surveillance remind me of when you read slave narratives, people talking about avoiding the paddle rollers, right? Or the ways in which United States social policy was crafted after the implementation of welfare to exclude blacks and poor people, right? Based on the same surveillance, they knew who they were. And so this leads me to another thought that I'll end with, and that the idea that the big data points that are being collated are not so much what the bits and pieces of data that are collected from whatever machines that we're using, but they condense out of the vapor of ideology, right? And so to me, that seems to be much more important. And I lied, I have one more thing. The last piece of it is, given the comments that Kate just made about, sorry to be familiar, Dr. Crawford, given the comments that you just made about the surveillance for commerce and the surveillance for the nation state being remarkably similar, right? If that's the way that it seems to be developing, is there a possibility for another type of information gathering potential? So the idea that Facebook, they had some competitor that was crowdfunded, diaspora, right? That went nowhere, right? But is it possible that Facebook could exist and collect the data that we find valuable in managing our relations without having to sell it in order to fund their activity?
Love it.
And so that would be, I guess
Yeah, let's take two questions. And there was somebody in the front. Yeah, how do you do it?
This will be quick because it relates to things that have already been mentioned, and something that actually Alice presented last year, which was this idea of outing on Facebook through targeted ads, and something as someone who is out but does not like that information being presented anytime I'm using Facebook, are what types of people we're talking about, other people you bring in to this development, are you looking at? Psychologists, people who look at these impacts that are not just related to money. And these are other professionals you can bring into the picture. Is that something that's being done, or how are you studying those kind of things? And I thought one other example that was brought up was something very simple with looking at the way Google Circles works. And there are different things that are not necessarily related to advertising that can make people feel more confident in the way they use these technologies. And I just opened that up to you all.
So I'll give everyone, I'll just start with one thing in terms of, is there another way? Well, one, of course there's another way. I mean, why wouldn't there be? It's just sort of seems obvious. And the other thing is I want to push back on that these products are free because if they're advertiser funded, it means that you pay for it when you buy that Coke, right? So there is no free in the sense that if I'm not paying Facebook directly, I'm paying Coca-Cola or whatever else I'm buying that's advertising on Facebook. So you could have, I mean, forget being utopian, you could have a profit-driven model that made the money-making more explicit rather than marketing it as free, because it's not. I mean, it's eventually paid for at the end by the consumer who buys the product that is being advertised. So I will leave that.
Really great questions. Because we're short of time, I'll just respond very briefly. I'm so glad that ideology is in the room. What I was trying to do today with my talk was to really get into some of these deeper cultural logics, which I think once we start talking at that level, it's less about, you know, wagging figures at a particular state agency or at a particular company. It's about looking at what are these operating logics and how are we participating in them. And it's when we figure out the contours of those logics that we can actually start to think about what forms of resistance will actually look like. But it's a great question, so thank you.
Sure. I'm also really glad. Thank you, ideology, for raising your head. Yeah, and actually one of the things that I think is very powerful there has to do with how ideologies shape particular technologies in the moment. But one of the things that we forget about these data collection streams is we don't know where they go. Like, where's the downstream? There is a long now of the cyber infrastructure, right? And it's unpredictable to us in the moment. But of course, you know, under conditions of regime change or ideological change, the same data that has been acquired, you know, 10 or 15 years or 5 years before suddenly takes on a different kind of valency. And, you know, I hate to do that thing of like, how long does it take till someone, you know, mentions Hitler. What's that rule? Yeah, thanks, the law. I'm just going to do it because, I mean, the notion of like the Jews that self-registered in the Netherlands that they were Jewish because that enabled them to have particular burial plots, right? And that was just sort of like what you would do in the 1910s or 1920s. And of course, by the time there was a regime change, then that information had a very different valence in a very different context. And that's one of the things that makes me a little bit nervous. That's also where I think unearthing that economic incentive of server behavior is actually so important. I mean, we talk a lot about privacy as, you know, particular kinds of checks and check boxes and, you know, squiggles that you can manipulate online that are about, you know, whether or not I want my friends to know things about me. But what about when I don't want the server to know something about me and I want my friends to know that? Like, what's my option there? I would love to have a little toggle that would say, you know, okay, Facebook, you can use this for a month for your advertising and after that delete it. Or I would like to be able to communicate this to these people but not to your server. For me, that's now turned into like, you know, I'm heading the carrier pigeon route. I'm actually getting a little bit crazier with my old age, right? But the notion is like, what other options are there for protecting that kind of privacy to make sure that that data doesn't travel in ways that we can't manage or control?
Yeah. So thank you, Andre. I think that you raised a really good point, and which is that ultimately this question is a social question. It's not actually a technological question, right? There are people on both ends. There are people that have their particular incentives behind the server. You know, there are people that are trying to communicate around. You know, there are people in the government that have like these ostensibly like, you know, positive motives, right? You know, these are people. The issue is a social one, and the question is like, what can we do to change society to get people to ensure that we're not kind of, you know, headed into a cliff. Thank you. I think that you know, in terms of alternative technologies, you know, you've got you know, I think one of the reasons why Snapchat is so popular is because, you know, it disappears off, you know, you have this kind of sense of security that it disappears. One of the things that I always thought, you know, knowing some of the technical aspects behind it is, you know, I'm not 100% sure that that's actually happening. I mean, yes, I believe that eventually it happens. Does it happen right away? Questionable, right? Because you have to have this, like, technological mediator, like actually having the information for some period of time. The government has collected data by tapping the cable lines, not actually, you know, going to anybody's servers, just actually looking at the information that's being transmitted over the lines. So it's like, I mean, if the information's out there, it's out there, you know. And in answer to the second question, my PhD is actually in psychology. So me and other people in Facebook are specifically looking at these things. And in my opinion, the phenomenon of, you know, sort of leaking unintentional information through, for instance, you get an advertisement on your Facebook feed and somebody looks over your shoulder and is like, why are you getting advertised that, right? Like that's a very difficult issue to control. I think that a good solution, which does not exist currently and probably has to come through policy, is to ensure that people have control, are the ones that are in control of their own data. right? So yeah, Facebook and Twitter and even diaspora the data has to be on some server at some point, right? And in fact, generally, in order to get a lot of the benefits that we want and need for our jobs, right? It has to be out there, it has to be on the server. So I think that, in my opinion, the best solution is actually a legal recourse where, you know, a law gets passed that says people have the option of deleting all of their data and the companies have to follow suit. I think that the same sort of law should apply in terms of the government, right? I think that people should be able to go to the government and say, I want you to tell me all of the data you've collected on me. Right? I think that should just be, not only I want to know what you've collected on me, but I want you to delete it. You know? I think that should be true of the government, I think that should be true of the corporations. And I personally believe that the only way that that's going to happen is by law.
We have 1 minute, so you get the very last quick comment. But we're going to continue discussing all this. So.
Sarah Watson, I'm a fellow at the Berkman Center for Internet and Society. I just wanted to touch on what you just said, which is actually both surprising that that's coming from Facebook, but not entirely surprising. Yeah. Is this idea that we're actually getting towards talking about regulating the uses of algorithms or holding companies accountable for the uses of data, and so talking about that social good use of getting people to vote more. Like, no one's going to argue that getting more people to vote is a good thing. The question being, you said that you don't have necessarily the information about how those people are voting, but we can ostensibly suggest that Facebook does have, you know, profile modeling of people's preferences. So in the dystopic version of that, you know, you're only, like, what percentages are you showing people that?
Right, we only show that to Republicans, right?
Exactly. Right, well, and so back to this idea of holding the companies accountable for the uses of those.
Right. So apparently we really have to shut down at night because we're accountable for that, but we agree on holding companies accountable as a good point to